So thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the invitation to come finally check out WAS. You've been floating around for years in my career, and I've never actually got to come see you, so nice to meet you all. Indeed, the topic is very general. I wanted to use this opportunity as a chance to talk about something I've been thinking about and see if maybe it resonates with some of you as well. That is, in general, when we talk about sexual health, we're remaining in our own area, within our own boundaries. What I mean by that is we may say that sexual behaviors can cause problems in creating disease, so sexually transmitted infection. They can cause health needs in the form of pregnancy. That sexual behaviors may be a sign of good general health. Okay, they themselves may be a piece of that. And also that sexual behaviors are a sign of also good mental health, unless you're having more sex than me, in which case it's poor mental health. But generally good mental health also, if you're sexually active. And that if you have satisfying, pleasurable sex, that this also may be an indication of some gender equality in that society, that there's appropriate trade-offs there. What this puts us in the position of arguing, though, is when we go to our granting agencies, or maybe you approach someone at your hospital, is making the argument for sex. We're constantly put in the position of saying sex is important because, and having to make this point over and over what exactly the links are. We could turn this around. So we could say, as the U.S. Surgeon General has hinted, that sex, fulfills a number of personal and social needs, and we value the sexual part of our being for the pleasures and benefits it affords us, and specifically, sexual health is inextricably bound to both physical and mental health. What evidence is there for that type of statement, though? There have been a couple of reviews that have tried to turn this around, with Roy Levin, Lisa Diamond, and her colleague, trying to say, how is it that sexual behaviors promote general health or can be used in promoting general health? And generally you see these in the forms of listicles in public media. So we'll say, oh, well, one reason sex is good is because it burns calories. Kind of. There have been a couple of studies of this. One actually suggested the calorie burn was quite poor. The other was of a large group of 21, 22-year-olds. May have been a bit more ambitious, that suggested the calorie burn was a bit better. But the arguments actually supporting the idea that sex is good exercise are quite poor. They're not well supported by data. We can speculate that many people masturbate before they go to sleep, so it probably helps promote sleep. I used to work in behavioral medicine, and I can tell you none of the sleep manuals recommended masturbation as a component of managing sleep disturbance. So I said, well, is this maybe written somewhere? Well, there has been one study looking at differences in sleep quality following masturbation or abstinence that found no difference, but there are no data actually demonstrating that masturbation promotes sleep. What about improved relationship satisfaction? So obviously there are tons of studies in the relationship literature, so I don't want to necessarily talk about those correlates. But rather, the use of sexual behavior in promoting that, this recent study with Lowenstein and colleagues, where they increased the frequency that couples were having sex, they were instructed to do so, and it decreased their relationship satisfaction. Oh no, we thought, right, that this should have been, oh great, they're more sexually active, that it would improve their satisfaction. Instead, it's gone the opposite direction. That's the extent of our evidence currently for using sex to promote relationship health. This idea that masturbation helps prostate health, it turns out those data are actually quite more mixed than I often have portrayed maybe, and perhaps some of us as well. And then the one shining light that I really liked was there is some evidence that sexual arousal in general promotes peripheral leukocytes, so the next step would be to demonstrate, so what? What does that mean? What effect does that have? But in general, these types of efforts, I would say, in our expression, would be weak sauce That is, if we want to make an argument that sexual behaviors are useful in promoting general health or doing something for other types of health problems, we don't have good evidence that that's the case. So I want to propose through 3 studies that we've worked on some possibilities for using sex in that way. So increasing the communication about what is important about our field. First, I'll talk about the use of multiple partners in those who have a history of child sexual and physical abuse. Using sex films to increase positive emotions, positive affect. And then also, what exactly is orgasm doing in the brain and how might we be able to use that? So with respect to more sex partners, generally we write more partners is bad, right? So for example, there's a study where they compared men and women who either had a history or didn't of childhood sexual abuse. And in particular, the more partners they had, this was cited as one of the consequences, the bad things that happen when someone has a history of childhood sexual abuse. So in a data collected in Gail Wyatt's laboratory, we had 353 men and women who had some history of childhood, either sexual or physical assault. And the ethnicity was quite varied. It was a very ethnically diverse sample. And in the context of this study, they took samples of urine and assayed dopamine from the urine. Now, what exactly does that mean? This is not as common of a measure. It was something they did that was easy in the clinic they were working in. Broadly, the amount of dopamine that's excreted is indicative of tonic stress. So this is just one example demonstrating that. There are a few, but obviously usually when we're talking about stressors, we would want other catecholamine assessments, but this is the assay we had to work with at the time. And if you compare in that 353 person sample, those who had 0 or 1 sexual partners, I got my pointer on, 0 or 1 sexual partners, or 2 or more. So these data had the typical skew with a long tail, so we bin them to look at it. There is a moderate effect size for those who've had fewer sex partners to have evidence of more stress. So when we talk about the consequences of sexual abuse victims, people who've gone through this in childhood and say, this is terrible, they have so many partners now, what are we going to do? I say maybe they're not being ignorant. Maybe they're using those partners in some way that's beneficial for their stress reduction and managing their symptoms. Now, how we do that such that they're able to still use that in a safe and healthy way is, of course, a separate question. With respect to sex films, we often, when we do these studies, don't always collect other positive affect. So, of course, when we show people erotica, they often say, well, I'm sexually aroused. What else? It turns out they often will report things like joy, excitement, not so much loving, it turns out. Don't report a lot of that after watching an erotic film. But it's not limited to sexual arousal. That is, the sex films are increasing a number of different positive emotions. Now, what does that mean and how can that be used? Within emotion regulation literature, broadly they talk about 3 ways of regulating your emotion. Of course, emotion regulation underlies a number of different types of mental and physical health problems. Generally, we want people to be skilled at this, to be able to do it well and with a minimum of resources. So one way of regulating affect is suppression. Some people argue that distraction is actually a method of suppression, so those are not so differentiated. The other broad method is reappraisal. So one, to kind of just push it out of mind, and the other is to actually actively engage it but change the nature of what it is you're observing. So these are both ways of kind of managing your emotions. And in particular, the distraction function, my God, could sex films not do this? What I think is interesting is normally the way we talk about people who use sex films to regulate their affect is as though it's a terrible thing. For example, regrettably, he had not found a healthy way to manage anger, and so ever since adolescence, he'd self-soothed either with alcohol, computer games, exercise, or porn. What if we're missing an opportunity? What if we should be using erotica to help people manage their self-regulation strategies? So erotica is very good at capturing attention. This is an eye tracking study from Amy Likens and colleagues showing the eye gaze as it bounces around a sexual image. Similarly, this is a well-replicated finding. If you look at a variety of different emotional stimuli, kind of rated on how pleasant and how activating an individual finds them, erotica is up here in this corner. It wins every time. It's very good at attracting attention. It's very good at generating general arousal. So a third case, we might be able to use some type of sexual behavior, sexual interaction to promote general health in a broader context, could be the afterglow from orgasm. We know very little about this, of course. So we used alpha index, which is a measure that comes from electroencephalography. So if you've ever seen an image of someone with a swim cap on with all the wires shooting off their head, that's electroencephalography or brain waves. And first we had a study where we demonstrated just that the alpha response that we were interested in does index sexual motivation. So this study has been published. And we show during the course of a 3-minute film, so this is to heterosexual men and women, and in this study we had 65 individuals. We basically just replicated something that's been demonstrated in a large number of other fields, that is that alpha does seem to be sensitive to sexual motivation, so that it alters in the expected way to indicate greater sex drive in the moment. So then we use that information, we use alpha as an index then to look and study orgasm. And so in this case, we had a sample for the orgasm study. It was a bit older, that it had 2 partners in the last year, so these are generally sexually experienced folks. And we follow their alpha over time. First, I'll show you the alpha plotted just from the course of watching a sex film, which I think is interesting. So initially, this is a neutral film. The alpha tends to stay pretty steady, but they have a strong alpha suppression when a sex film initially comes on. That's essentially their brain saying, ooh, what's that? I see something, that's really fascinating. And this kind of dip back seems to be pretty consistent. That is, the attention span is just such that even though the film is continuing, it kind of waxes and wanes a bit. So we're seeing some alpha fluctuation over time. And with orgasm specifically, as previous speakers have mentioned, the consistency appears to be much higher for men than for women. And we have a very good marker for orgasm as well. That is, we can assay contractions that are associated with it to characterize whether it started or stopped and what the intensity of it might be. There's tremendous variability, of course, in the nature of orgasm. So that is whether it's partnered or solo, and how much they're finding a particular orgasm satisfying, whether they felt there were spasms with it. I'm mentioning all this basically to say we're the tip of the iceberg. So we're measuring orgasms in the way that we are, but there's much, much yet to understand and break down about the particular orgasms we measured in the lab. So how do you make orgasms in the lab? You can give someone a tool and say, go to town, let me know when you're done. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to know exactly how much energy had been put into the system so that we could quantify that. So we gave people a cue to say the vibrator was about to come on and for how long it would be on. That time varied. This is when the vibrator was actually on, the screen confirming that they should feel something, and if they didn't, to let us know. And then they had a rest period. And those periods were divided up in this way. They would get the cue for 6 seconds, and then have the stimulation period that started out being 5 seconds long and a 10-second rest. And then the next period would be 30 seconds long and a 30-second rest. And we would increase this until people felt they'd experienced orgasm, at which time they would hit a big red button. And then when they felt it was over, they would hit the big red button again. And yes, they did sometimes forget to hit the button. There are, of course, a number of challenges to doing this type of work I'm happy to talk about associated with movement and that type of thing. We use a very popular vibrator that you may have seen if you treat anorgasmia, with attachments that stimulate the male mid-shaft or the female over the clitoral hood. And at this time, we have 9 folks that have completed the study, so it's a relatively small sample, clearly. We used a bit of a different design in that we are collecting data with a wireless EEG headset, which allows us to correct for some of the movement that occurs during high-intensity sexual stimulation, also with the vibrator. And this is just to give you a flavor of the alpha. It varies quite widely per individual, so each of these lines represents an individual's alpha tracking over time until the onset of orgasm. And then this is the important part. People who bothered to study in this area often then turn off the device when the orgasm happens, and we left it on because we wanted to know what exactly is the benefit that may be happening, or something that we could use, look at the changes over time. What is that afterglow? What is that feeling? And broadly, what we see, what these head plots show, is this is after orgasm. Oops, my red dot here. So these all show head plots of the average over all those individuals. And this is average, so you can see it a little bit better. And basically what you should see is that strong red glow in the 8 to 12 hertz range. That's the alpha range. After orgasm, so after this spike, there's an afterburn. So there's increasing alpha associated with sexual arousal, which we've seen before with the sex films, which we see with the vibrator stimulation. But then post-orgasm, there's a nice kind of coasting or engagement that appears to be most prominent in the alpha band to the exclusion of other areas. Alpha has been associated with a number of different things, including focus, including relaxation, including, if we know this about orgasm, what does that tell us about how we can use it? How we can use it in broader health. So we currently have a grant to use sexual stimulation to try to disrupt depressive rumination. So I think this is a good example of kind of the direct application of how you can use sex in general health. There are also several studies now that have presented the ability of sexual arousal, being in a sexually aroused state, to reduce disgust. One of the hardest parts of treating obsessive compulsive disorder can be getting people to engage with those disgusting stimuli. So what if you had people in a sexually aroused state when you're engaging them in that hierarchy? Can we use this to help treat OCD? So as Diamond and Huebner had noted recently, this paradigm shift has not taken place. That is, the study of sexuality remains marginalized within health psychology. I think this is one way to move it along. I want to thank my collaborators, and I don't know that I have time for questions.